Excellent reading of that. How much of that information was new to you? You know me, I love history, and I love bringing you that and helping us make meaning by looking back and looking forward. So I've got some big thoughts to hold because we're good at complexity, right? Okay. The precursor to Mother's Day came from the abolitionist and suffragette Julia Ward Howe. In 1870, Howe wrote the Mother's Day Proclamation, a call to action that asked mothers to unite in promoting world peace. In 1873, Howe campaigned for a Mother's Peace Day to be celebrated. Anna Jarvis conceived of Mother's Day as a way of honoring the sacrifices mothers made for their children. There are lots of bits of history that we could talk about all about Mother's Day, but those are two I want you to hold up. Mother's Day was a way to honor peace and the sacrifices made for children. Got it? Got it, got it? All right. Now, you just heard 63 years ago, Unitarianism and Universalism merged as an association. And these folks have been sharing ministers for 100 years, which is kind of hilarious that they were like making all these assumptions about one another, and yet the same people were preaching to them, right? Both saw possibilities in the merger and both worried about what would come if they merged, and they also united in pluralistic views, our theme this month. And they could also talk about the idea of God is love and all is one, but then they left God out when they merged, at least in Article 2. Here again, Article 2, we've been hearing about that for a few years now. Article 2 changes. So we're going to vote at General Assembly again on changes to Article 2. There will be other people in this pulpit talking about more changes to Article 2 in however many years. It'll keep changing. We are a faith that changes. Both faiths were liberal and both rejected some of the traditional elements of Christianity. They knew they could unite in Unitarianism, the idea of one God, right? Not a Trinity. And throughout the 1800s and 1900s, they had more in common theologically and philosophically. They both strongly believed that freedom and personal conscience should dictate their beliefs in this world. And as such, they both refused to have a creed or a statement of belief as a necessity for you to pledge to in order to be a member. Members of both groups believed that it was more important to be moral and a good person in this life than count on an afterlife. You can see how covenant was being brought into that. Covenant was older than that, but they were bringing that forth. They had so much in common, and as other Christian traditions became less strict about creed, there was less and less that was differentiating both the Unitarians and the Universalists. There were so many reasons for them to merge. And there were meetings and meetings and meetings and discussions and letters for 100 years. You think we've talked about Article 2 too long, right? 100 years. But it didn't happen for 100 years. Why do you think the main reason was? Strains ears, minister sees if they say anything. They're afraid to get it wrong, Reverend Denise, so why don't you just tell them? Classism. Right? Classism. Which is an interesting thing for us to hold and think about how that impacts our congregations today. Unitarians thought that Universalists were uneducated and that their ministers didn't have any Harvard degrees that they felt was really important. They thought the Universalists were too theologically conservative and too emotional. They shared feelings. Conversely, the Universalists felt that the Unitarians were too elite, rational, and snooty. They feared that their traditions and beliefs would be subsumed by the Unitarians. Basically, they both suffered from a belief that the other side was not like them. They weren't getting to know each other, right? They weren't practicing peace by actually talking to each other. Remember, Mother's Day, peace? So for almost 100 years, the merger was rejected because these issues could not be overcome. In fact, today there's a tiny group of grumpy Unitarians who think we never should have merged in 1961 and have recently formed a new North American Unitarian Association that rejects universalism and the theology brought with it. I find myself often wondering how much classism is really at play in that group, as opposed to what they say is at play. My friend and colleague, Reverend Christine Dance, says the difference between the two denominations was also described by Thomas Starr King. What's the other seminary that's not in Chicago? Starr King was our other UU seminary, right? He actually straddled both groups. He was raised in the Universalist Church, and then he became a minister in the Unitarian Church as an adult. He had a famous quote that summed up the difference between the two groups. I love this. Thank you, Reverend Dance, for finding this. He refers to the Universalists and then to the Unitarians. One thinks God is too good to damn them forever. The other thinks they are too good to be damned. So we have Mother's Day, bringing people together to honor peace and sacrifices made for children. We have Unitarians and Universalists wanting to form a powerful association of a liberal faith, God is one, love for all. They seem, all these folks wanted to fully embrace UU values and see the worthiness and dignity of people united in peace and love. Hold that thought, you can do it. Today we're also celebrating Flower Communion, and Norbert and his wife, Maja Chapek, joined the Unitarian Church in New Jersey in 1921. They were probably in on some of those conversations that were happening about merging and this and that. And they probably joined for the same reason a lot of you did. Their children liked the RE program. If Marta's in here, someone tell her that. World War I had ended. Chapek thought, hey, I can go back home to Czechoslovakia. And his Unitarian church was the Prague Liberal Religious Fellowship. And in just 20 years, he had over 3,000 members. Go, Norbert. The traditional Christian community service of bread and wine did not meet the needs of this congregation because his church, like ours, had people who believed different things, and Christian community was not the right symbol to bring them together. And so he turned to something he had learned from women religious educators in the state and women ministers, the flower ceremony. Plus, who can resist the beauty of flowers? So in 1923, he developed his version of the flower ceremony, which we celebrated the 100th anniversary of last year, and he asked his congregants to bring a flower to church from their gardens or a field or the roadside and put them in a vase. And Chapek was a visionary minister with the church ahead of its time, a bold church, a place that was a hangout, a community center, it had a restaurant, right? Had a library. And he thought about all these things and how each flower symbolized peace and love and uniting the congregation, coming together in vases. And he had borrowed it from a children's ceremony that was popular in the US, right? From the RE departments in these Unitarian and Universalist congregations. And the women who helped Mother's Day were envisioning a new way, a new celebration of coming together for peace and honoring sacrifices. And today is that coming together of Unitarianism and Universalism. And it had seen lots of people, saw lots of ways to keep people apart for 100 years, but they too wanted to build a new and peaceful way. And as time went on, Chapek was facing terrible Nazism, and eventually he was arrested and subjected to starvation and torture. And he even held a flower ceremony with his fellow prisoners, finding whatever flowers or weeds they could in the concentration camp. And they testified to a beauty larger than themselves and a love that could outlive them. Indeed, the Nazis did kill Norbert Chapek. But his spirit, his courage, and his commitment live on today in each and every one of you. These qualities have passed now to us to make them ours and make them real. And what we are about to do is not a historical reenactment of something over and done, but an affirmation of our continuity with the generations of struggle for ever-widening liberty. In the spirit of mothers who envisioned peace, in the spirit of Unitarian Universalists who came together for 63 years ago today, in the hopes of a larger and more vibrant liberal faith, in the spirit of Norbert Chopik, I ask you now,